Eric Lindell coming to you from New York City with video number 1 in the conspiracy series. And I would like to impart to you my own personal take on certain recent events like the shooting in Parkland, Florida, Sandy Hook, a little bit about Las Vegas, and Charlottesville, North Carolina, and even less recently, things like 9/11 and the shooting of JFK, because I believe they're all intertwined. So I want to start today by talking about certain reference points to bear in mind as you learn about these conspiracies, if you haven't already. So this is basically geared for someone just starting to learn about these things. And, that was me not too long ago. And I know how difficult it was to glean sufficient information to feel that I had a grasp on the situation and to feel that I was justified in an opinion. And there's no question in my mind the status of, such tragedies as, Sandy Hook, Parkland, Florida, and 9/11, and even JFK. So let me see how efficiently I can impart that to you. So let's start with a couple of things. One is the federal law that authorizes the federal government to perpetrate propaganda and psychological operations and false flags on the American public. If you've been going at, learning about Parkland, Florida, and all the other ones without knowing that, well, that's a pretty severe handicap. And if you know that this federal law exists, you're much, much better poised to understand the information that's presented to you online, in print, or any of, myriad other media. Okay, there's a federal law that authorizes the government to basically try to fool the public, and you'll never guess what the reason is for that law's existence. Obviously, it's because they intend to use that authority. Mind you, not that the absence of such a law prevented them from engaging in those things, because as far as I can tell, they did that as much before the law as after. Because as you well know, when you're dealing with the federal government, the law and the Constitution is of dubious relevance. This is 2018, and that is the reality as I understand it. So another thing to look at is the media. Where are you getting your information from, and how much trust have you put in those sources, and how justified were you in trusting them? Well, I'm here to tell you there's no such thing as a reliable source anywhere. By virtue of merely existing and wanting to breathe another breath, that gives you or any other source a bias. So then, how can you possibly get a reliable picture of the world? Well, by taking information from myriad sources and creating a whole constellation of viewpoints that may at first confuse you, befuddle you, make you anxious, whatever. But the picture grows clearer and clearer and clearer, and at some point you have clarity that you can clearly recognize as superior to what you had before. If you were reading the Times every day and believing what you read, when you finally have a coming to terms with with reality, I hate this thing. You will recognize the picture as one of vastly greater clarity than before. And I have to tell you, without wanting to be condescending necessarily, I think that there's a component of infantile regression in believing one or two news sources. As an infant, I believed my parents because who the hell else was I going to believe? When I was 9 years old, and I don't know, there was a mentalist named Dunninger on TV reading people's minds and having the subject assure the audience that he and Dunninger had never spoken before, had never communicated about this before, so you knew the mind reading was genuine. One of these subjects was a mayor. And in my infinite 9-year-old wisdom, I knew that he had to be telling the truth because he was a politician. And anybody trusted with public service of necessity tells the truth. And it would be inconceivable to think otherwise. Well, needless to say, I don't think that way anymore. And I want to point out, it's not just politicians that are unreliable. Nothing is reliable. Nothing under this sun, embodied on this earth, breathing in this atmosphere is reliable. But put enough sources together, you can get an accurate picture, but that takes work, which, as I say, I'm going to try to help you reduce. But we need to have that reference point that if you're thinking anything because you read it in the Times, knock it off, because we're not going to get anywhere if that's what you're thinking. Now, ask yourself whether you remember the candidacy of Ron Paul. It wasn't that long ago. I don't remember the year, but he had a fair amount of popular support, but relatively little coverage in the press. If you don't remember that, look it up, because it's a very salient fact of our recent history and regarding the reliability or lack thereof of our popular and mainstream media. There was little coverage because the media is not independent of the political parties. So if you have some shenanigans going on in the Democrat or Republican Party, and it's not covered in the media, but only by some alternative source of information, like on YouTube or wherever, don't dismiss that information or that source as the ranting of a lunatic or conspiracy theorist, but recognize it's to be expected. If there are shenanigans of a certain type among the major parties, then it may not be reflected in the news sources that pretty much dominate public opinion, like the Times, the networks, and a few others. There's not that many. So we have the federal law authorizing psychological operations on the people. We have the unreliability of the media. There was one other thing I wanted to start with, but let's start with those two. These are reference points, anchors, you might say, when the information seems to be overwhelming and there's just so much information issuing from so many sources as regards these controversial events that it can be overwhelming. So try to do this step by step. I want to start with something that's of particular interest to me, and that is the arrest of Nikolas Cruz and the charges that have been pressed against him, for which he's being tried, I think, for a possible capital crime. I mean, they might end up frying this kid, and I'm not going to be too happy if that happens, and I hope you won't be either. And I hope once we go over this, maybe you'll join me in an effort to help this kid. There's so much, effort to, help the children. It's a kind of cliche. And I'm trying to pull this screen back down to size. It's a cliche to help the kids. But then you have a mentally ill 19-year-old kid who's being framed, and nobody seems to be too concerned about it. I started a Facebook page asking people to, join me in an effort to publicize the fact that poor Nicholas is being framed. So there is a pretty well-known video where a student of Parkland named Alexa, I'm not going to get her name right, Meidnick or something, is saying that when the building was being evacuated, she was talking to Nikolas Cruz in the hallway. She joked with him, hey, I'm surprised it wasn't you, and she said, he just gives me a, huh? And there's a journalist interviewing Alexa, and he goes, really? So when she said this, she had such poise, such confidence, and such connection to the interviewer, I am strongly inclined to believe what she said. Now, I don't put that much credence in all of the other witnesses to the Parkland incident, because frankly, some of them sound like they are full of you-know-what. And there's one in particular I have to give special consideration to, and this is somebody that I think we've all heard of who was interviewing shooting survivors apparently in the closet while people were being murdered, like outside the closet, and he's not like being still and chill and quiet. He's interviewing people. I'm not sure I buy that. I'm not sure I take that at face value. But the most peculiar thing about one of his interviews is that he announces the time as, I believe he says, 9:32 a.m., which, as I'm sure you know by now, is fully 5 hours before the shooting started. This wasn't supposed to happen. Well, it can be pretty surprising how amateurish these false flags are, and doubly surprising how few people can see through it. 9:32 a.m. was fully 4 hours and 50 minutes before the official beginning of the shooting, the firing of the first shot. And there's David Hogg in his full and glorious splendor interviewing somebody and asking what their message is, wink, wink, which just happens to be, you'll never guess, gun control, because this person, their whole life, thought that they would be a good gun-toting citizen who, arms themselves with proper, military firearms for the protection of the public and the family. But now that this hideous shooting has taken place, or is going to take place, they no longer believe in gun ownership, and they no longer support the NRA. Well, what a convenient message that is for the people who are staging this event, because, well, we'll get to that also. It's not just gun grabbers, although God knows it's certainly them. There's others involved too. So this guy, David Hogg, I find him sickening. He's just, on the face of it, he is lying with a bald face to the American public. And if you don't know that, you better find that out, because it's very, very critical to understanding how this event and its aftermath are unfolding. It's not optional to believe this guy. He is lying through his teeth, has been doing so all along. You must know that. If you don't, you got to find out. And I'm going to try to help you. If I only knew how to use this technology, I would insert a clip right here showing where he announces the time 5 hours before the shooting. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to figure out a way to do this. But for the time being, I'll ask you to take on faith that there is footage of him lying, and that is, I guess, one of the points that I want to emphasize about Parkland. It's always good to start out with what you know for certain. you know for certain that David Hogg is lying. It's not negotiable. And again, I will make available some clips to demonstrate that. We know that the government is legally authorized to perpetrate this type of false flag on the American public. We know that the media is strongly biased and will refrain from conveying any information that happens to run contrary to the agenda that they share with others outside of the media, including the political parties. And one last thing about Nikolas Cruz, because this is very, very sad. There are several different accounts of Nikolas' arrest, and they conflict with one another. In particular, there is a shot of Nikolas being arrested, a still shot, where he's being cuffed and he's lying on the ground and he's looking into the camera. This is such an obviously theatrical shot. It looks almost like he's wearing makeup. His, he's wide awake, eyes wide open. His pants are sort of hanging low on his waist, but his shorts, underneath are pulled up high. There is another bit of footage where Nikolas is being arrested in an entirely different context. Okay, don't ask me how it's possible for the guy to be arrested twice. Once where he's wide awake, wide-eyed looking into the camera, and the other time where he is clearly unconscious, chemically lobotomized. When they try to move his arms to arrest him, they flop like that. Like there's zero volitional, control issuing from his body. How on earth is this possible? I said it before, let me say it again. It's mind-boggling, the amateurishness of these efforts. And the only thing more mind-boggling is that they actually get away with it. And I think the idea is that as long as 95% of the people go along with it, it doesn't matter if 5% don't. So let me offer some conjecture. This is like a detail, and this is definitely surmisal on my part. I don't want to act like it's an essential part of the overall argument for Nikolas' innocence or the false flag status of the Parkland shooting. But I would like to ask why they pulled his underwear up. And I say that, it's a theatrical shot, okay? Somebody pulled up his underwear. There's plenty of other shots of him. His underwear is not visible in any of them. Well, actually, there is one. But anyway, this is what I want to say. They're trying to enhance the plausibility that he was the shooter. So they're trying to impart to him an attribute of hip-hop culture, namely pulling the shorts up to be visible over the, above the pants. And hip-hop culture is known for a certain affinity to violence. So this, I think, is supposed to enhance their claim in the mind of a public that is, please forgive me for so saying, but unreasonably gullible, that this boy, this child, Nikolas Cruz, really is a violent person and really was capable of shooting and killing all of those people. Now, there's other information they have about this guy that's at least as interesting as the visible shorts. Namely, apparently, he was affiliated with a right-wing militia. And of course, we know how violent right-wing militias are, so such an affiliation clearly enhances the probability that he would be a violent mass murderer in the minds of the proverbial public. Okay, now take these two things and put them together. How many members of hip-hop culture, or participants in hip-hop culture, are also members of right-wing militias? It is the goofiest thing I've ever seen in my life. There is also, of course, the accusations of mental illness with violent tendencies, and as evidence goes, these tweets where he says, "Oh, I want to blow up the world and kill," of all types of evidence, tweets or anything, keyboard over the internet is on the low end of credibility. Let me put it a better way, is on the high end of fakeability. So, as we explore this situation further, and I really do hope that you'll join me because I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to, helping anybody who may be interested, however slightly, to come to an understanding of these events, because they're very, very important, and we'll talk more about the kind of momentous events that may hinge on them, including something that our 16th president was ruminating about back in the 1860s, namely civil war, for which there are copious preparations on both sides to the tune of billions and billions of rounds of military-grade ammunition just waiting for a gun grab to happen as a trigger of what one Navy SEAL called a gruesome massacre. But I don't really think that's going to happen, and I hope you don't either, but we should keep in mind that it could. So, until next time, I'm Eric Lindell, and stick around, we have a lot more coming.